More than 90% of all goods traded between countries move by ship at some point. With the UN's big climate conference about to begin next week in Egypt, there's intense scrutiny on efforts to cut carbon footprints in the transportation industry, particularly shipping. Our correspondent Chris Brown is back from Copenhagen, Denmark, where he has been looking at shipping industry's efforts to decarbonize. Chris, thanks so much for joining us. Set the scene. We know the target the UN has set to keep global warming at under 1.5 degrees to avoid catastrophic impacts. Let's talk about how big an emitter shipping is in the equation.
Well, shipping globally releases emissions equivalent to a country the size of Germany, so it's huge. And because a lot of the time ships are out at sea until quite recently, the world's fleet of roughly 20,000 large ocean-going vessels was really able to escape a lot of the scrutiny that's been paid to other parts of the transportation sector. At the last COP meeting in Glasgow, 22 countries, including Canada, took the first small steps towards decarbonizing, promising to set up green corridors between different ports where carbon-neutral fuels and infrastructure would be available. But worldwide, the bill is going to be huge, at least $2 trillion Canadian to cut emissions by 2050. And new fuel is the biggest challenge. So we did go to Copenhagen. We visited MAN Energy Solutions, where they have a huge ship test engine there. It's 4 stories tall. And we met with their head of research and development. Brian Sorensen told us that engineers are experimenting with different kinds of zero-emission fuels, such as methanol and ammonia, both of which can be made sustainably.
The challenge will be on the fuel side, so making the fuel available and having infrastructure at different bunkering ports available. And I also think that is why that these green corridors discussion and initiatives you are seeing, that will be a very, very important step in the transition.
But as I say, there is no industry agreement on the fuel of the future. Maersk, which is based in Copenhagen, is the world's #2 container shipper, has made a big bet on methanol, and it's ordered 19 new methanol-powered large ships. But many other nations are resisting such big purchases, as it's not clear to everyone how quickly these green investments are going to pay off, John.
Chris, you're always so good at getting to these unique angles when it comes to the fight against climate change. So let's talk about this a little more. What is the shipping industry saying about how it plans to deal with transitioning away from polluting ships and fuels?
Well, one of the things that was clear from that COP gathering last year is that the industry does need better regulations, better leadership to get everyone on the same page. It is, of course, a global industry. The regulator is the United Nations International Maritime Organization, and its stated goal is to simply cut emissions in half by 2050, not eliminate them completely. And that timetable doesn't align with the Paris Agreement goals. Nor is there agreement on a tax on carbon for ships that burn stinky bunker fuel that pollutes. Some nations want a tax as high as $100 per ton of emissions, some just $2 a ton. In Copenhagen, we spoke to the Global Maritime Forum. It's a nonprofit group that is pushing for a high price on carbon, with proceeds plowed back into the industry to help with the transition.
They need to set a target for decarbonization to really set the direction for the industry and for the sector at large. But then they also need to implement policy measures that will enable the transition.
So these UN summits, like the one that's coming up in Cairo starting on Monday, can help generate change. Promises are pretty easy to make. Action is difficult. And for the shipping industry, going green is still very new. So the goal of this particular Cairo meeting, which comes against the backdrop of the war in Ukraine and a global energy crisis, is going to be to ensure that that is not an excuse for this industry to back off. John.
Thanks for this, Chris. CBC's Chris Brown in London.